The sun was getting ready to set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky orange and pink. Most folks would call it beautiful, but Jake wasn't looking up. His eyes were glued to the cracked sidewalk as he walked through the small desert town. Each step hurt because his shoes had holes in them, and his feet were covered in blisters. Jake's clothes told a story he didn't want anyone to read. His jeans were ripped at the knees, not from fashion, but from falling down too many times. His shirt used to be white, but now it was gray with dirt and stains he couldn't even remember getting. He smelled bad and he knew it. When was the last time he had a real shower? 2 weeks? 3? Time didn't mean much anymore when every day was just about surviving. His stomach made a loud growling sound. The last real meal he had was 3 days ago when a kind lady at a gas station bought him a sandwich. Before that, he'd been living on whatever he could find, leftover fries from restaurant dumpsters, half-eaten apples from trash cans. His pride had died somewhere along the way, replaced by the simple need to not starve. The $20 bill in his back pocket was gone now. He'd spent it on gas 3 states back, thinking he could make it to California where his cousin lived. But the car broke down just outside Cedar Ridge, and the mechanic wanted $300 to fix it. Jake didn't have $3, let alone $300. So he sold the car for $50 to a scrap dealer and started walking again as he moved through the town. Jake noticed how people looked at him, or rather, how they tried not to look at him. A woman coming out of the grocery store saw him, approaching and quickly crossed to the other side of the street. A man in a business suit walked faster when Jake got near. Kids pointed until their parents pulled them away and whispered, "Don't stare." He understood. He looked like trouble. He looked like someone who might ask for something, and people didn't like being asked, but Jake was getting desperate. His mouth was so dry it felt like sandpaper, and there was a water fountain outside the post office that kept calling to him. He walked over and bent down to drink. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it was water. As he drank, he saw his reflection in the little puddle that had formed below the fountain. The face looking back at him was almost unrecognizable. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes had dark circles around them, and his hair was long and messy. When had he gotten so thin? When had he started looking so broken? A group of teenagers walked by, laughing about something on their phones. One of them saw Jake and nudged his friend. "Look at that homeless guy," he whispered, but not quietly enough. Jake pretended not to hear. He'd learned that reacting only made things worse. The main street of Cedar Ridge was lined with small shops, a hardware store, a diner that smelled like bacon and coffee, a barber shop with an old-fashioned spinning pole. Normal life was happening all around him, but Jake felt like he was watching it through glass. He was outside of it all, separate from the world where people had jobs and homes and enough food to eat. Near the diner, he saw a middle-aged couple finishing their meal at an outdoor table. The woman had left half her sandwich untouched. Jake's stomach cramped with hunger as he watched her wrap it in a napkin and throw it away. For a moment, he thought about asking if he could have it, but the words wouldn't come. Some part of his pride was still hanging on, making everything harder. As the evening got darker, Jake knew he needed to find somewhere to sleep. Last night he'd curled up behind a closed gas station, but someone had called the police. The officer was nice enough. He didn't arrest Jake or anything, but he told him to move along. "Can't have you sleeping here, son? It's not safe, and the owner doesn't like it." Jake had nodded and walked away, spending the rest of the night sitting on a bench at a 24-hour laundromat, pretending to wait for his clothes to finish washing. The fluorescent lights buzzed all night, and the hard plastic seat made his back ache. But at least he was indoors. Now he was facing another night with nowhere to go. Cedar Ridge didn't seem like the kind of town that had homeless shelters. It was too small, too quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stuck out like sore thumbs. Jake found himself walking toward the residential area, where the houses got smaller and the yards got bigger. Maybe he could find a porch to sleep under, or a shed that wasn't locked. He wasn't looking to steal anything. He just needed a place to rest where no one would bother him. The neighborhood was peaceful. Porch lights were starting to come on. And through windows he could see families eating dinner together, watching TV, living their normal lives. It made his chest tight with longing. When was the last time he'd sat at a dinner table? When was the last time someone had been happy to see him? His phone had died weeks ago, and he didn't have a charger anyway. The silence was the worst part. Sometimes. No one to call, no one to text, no connection to the world except for these brief moments when strangers looked at him with pity or disgust. As he walked down a quiet street lined with small houses, Jake's legs started to shake. He was exhausted, hungry, and running out of hope. Each house he passed looked warm and safe, full of people who belonged somewhere. He didn't belong anywhere anymore. Finally, he couldn't take another step. His vision was getting blurry and he felt dizzy. There was an old man sitting on a porch, wearing boots and a cowboy hat, just watching the sunset. Jake knew he should keep walking, should leave the man alone, but something in his face looked kind. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Jake's feet carried him up the gravel driveway before his brain could stop him. The old man looked up as he approached, but didn't seem scared or angry, just curious. Jake's mouth was so dry he could barely speak, but the words came out anyway, raw and honest and full of shame. "Sir, I don't know what else to do. I'm grimy, needy, and barely alive." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Jake had never said anything so true or so humbling in his entire life. He stood there, swaying slightly, waiting for the old man to tell him to move along. Like everyone else had. The old man didn't flinch when Jake spoke those desperate words. Most people would have looked uncomfortable, maybe made an excuse to go inside or reach for their phone to call someone. But this man just sat there in his wooden rocking chair, studying Jake's face with eyes that seemed to see everything. The silence stretched between them for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Jake's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands were shaking, and not just from hunger. He'd just laid his soul bare to a complete stranger, admitted he was at rock bottom, and now he was waiting to be rejected again. The old man had weathered skin, the kind that comes from years under the desert sun. His hair was gray and thin under. His cowboy hat and his clothes were simple, worn jeans, a flannel shirt that had seen better days, and boots that were scuffed but well cared for. He looked like he belonged in this small town, like he'd been part of it forever. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was quiet, rough around the edges like sandpaper, but there was something gentle in it, too. "So was I once," he said, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. Those 4 words carried weight like they came from somewhere deep and real. The man stood up slowly, his joints creaking a little. He wasn't tall, maybe average height, but there was something solid about him. Steady, like a tree that had weathered a lot of storms but was still standing. He looked Jake up and down, not with judgment but with understanding. "Come inside," he said simply. Jake's first instinct was to say no. He'd learned not to trust kindness from strangers. It usually came with strings attached or expectations he couldn't meet. But his legs were barely holding him up, and the smell of food coming from inside the house was making his stomach cramp with need. "I don't have any money," Jake said quickly. "I can't pay you back for anything." The old man just nodded toward the front door. "Didn't ask for money." Jake followed him up the porch steps, each one feeling like a mountain. The front door was painted blue, with little chips where the desert wind had worn it down over the years. When it opened, Jake was hit with the smell of coffee and something cooking on the stove. It smelled like home, though Jake couldn't remember what home was supposed to feel like anymore. The inside of the house was simple but clean. Nothing fancy, just a couch that had been sat in a lot, a coffee table covered with magazines about ranching and horses, and walls decorated with old photographs. Jake caught glimpses of rodeo pictures, men on horses, ribbons and trophies from competitions long past. "Name's Roy," the old man said, hanging his hat on a hook by the door. "What should I call you?" It felt strange to say his own name out loud. He'd been anonymous for so long, just another face in the crowd of people nobody wanted to see. Roy nodded and headed toward what Jake assumed was the kitchen. "You hungry?" It was such a simple question, but Jake almost started crying right there. When was the last time someone had asked about his needs without making him beg first? "Yes, sir," he managed to say. "Good, made too much dinner anyway." The kitchen was small but warm. There was a pot of something simmering on the stove, and the coffee maker was bubbling away in the corner. Roy moved around the space like he'd done this routine 1,000 times. He pulled out a chair at the small wooden table and pointed to it. "Sit." Jake sat, trying not to think about how dirty he was, how out of place he must look in this clean, comfortable house. Roy opened cabinets and pulled out a plate, a fork, a glass. Normal things that Jake hadn't used in weeks. The food Roy put in front of him was simple: beef stew with big chunks of meat and vegetables, a piece of cornbread, and a glass of cold water. But to Jake, it looked like a feast. His hands were shaking as he picked up the fork. "Go ahead," Roy said, pouring himself a cup of coffee and sitting down across from Jake. "It's not fancy, but it'll fill you up." The first bite was like a small miracle. Real food, hot and seasoned and filling. Jake tried to eat slowly, tried to have some dignity, but his body had other ideas. He was so hungry that he finished the entire plate in what felt like minutes. Roy watched him eat without saying anything. There was no pity in his eyes, no disgust at Jake's table manners. Just quiet understanding, like he'd been exactly where Jake was and remembered what real hunger felt like. When Jake finished, Roy got up and refilled his plate without being asked. "Eat as much as you want," he said. "Plenty more where that came from." This time Jake forced himself to slow down. As his stomach started to feel full for the first time in days, he began to notice other things. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock somewhere. There were no sounds of traffic or sirens or people arguing, just peace. "Thank you," Jake said finally, pushing the empty plate away. "I don't know how to thank you enough," Roy just shrugged. "Don't need thanks. We all need help sometimes." Jake looked around the kitchen, taking in the details. There were pictures. On the refrigerator, Roy with horses, Roy with other cowboys, Roy receiving some kind of award, but no family pictures. No wife or kids smiling back from the magnets. "You live here alone?" Jake asked. "Yep, just me and the horses now." Roy's voice didn't sound sad about it. Just matter fact. Jake wanted to ask more questions, but exhaustion was hitting him like a wave. The warm food, the safety of being indoors, the relief of not having to worry about where he'd sleep tonight. It was all catching up with him. Roy must have noticed him swaying in his chair. "When's the last time you slept in a real bed?" Jake tried to remember. "A couple weeks, maybe. Been sleeping outside mostly." Roy nodded and stood up. "Come on, got a spare room." Jake followed him down a short hallway lined with more rodeo pictures. Roy opened a door to reveal a small bedroom with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the desert. The bed had clean sheets and a quilt that looked handmade. "Bathroom's right across the hall. Towels are in the closet. You can clean up if you want." Roy paused at the doorway. "Door doesn't lock, but you don't need to worry about that here." Jake stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed. It was such a simple space, but after weeks of sleeping on the ground or on park benches, it felt like luxury. "I don't understand why you're doing this." Roy looked at him for a long moment. "Told you already? I was where you are once. Rock bottom. Lower than low. Someone helped me when I needed it most." He shrugged. "Figured I owe the universe some good karma." After Roy left and closed the door softly behind him, Jake just stood there for a few minutes, afraid to move. Afraid this was all a dream and he'd wake up back on the street. But the bed was real, the clean towels were real, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake felt safe. Jake woke up to the sound of roosters crowing somewhere in the distance. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The bed was soft, the room was quiet, and sunlight was streaming through clean windows. Then reality hit him. He was in Roy's house. And somehow he'd slept through the entire night without waking up once. He sat up slowly, his body aching in places he'd forgotten about. When you sleep on the ground for weeks, you get used to constant pain. But now that he'd slept on a real mattress, Every muscle was reminding him how much damage he'd been doing to himself. The clock on the dresser said 6:30 in the morning. Jake could hear movement in the kitchen, the sound of coffee brewing and pans clattering softly. He got up and looked out the window. The desert stretched out forever, painted gold by the morning sun. In the distance, he could see horses grazing. In a fenced pasture, Jake made his way to the bathroom and caught sight of himself in the mirror. He looked better than he had in weeks, but still rough. His hair was sticking up in all directions, and his clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in them. Roy had mentioned something about towels last night. The shower was small, but clean, with water pressure that actually worked. Jake stood under the hot water for longer than he should have, watching weeks of dirt and grime swirl down the drain. He found a bar of soap that smelled like pine trees and scrubbed it until his skin was red. It felt like he was washing away more than just dirt, like he was cleaning off some of the shame and desperation that had been clinging to him. When he finally came out of the bathroom, he felt more human than he had in a long time. His clothes were still dirty, but at least he was clean underneath them. He could smell bacon cooking, and his stomach reminded him that one good meal yesterday wasn't enough to make up for weeks of barely eating. Roy was standing at the stove when Jake walked into the kitchen, flipping pancakes like he'd been doing it his whole life. He looked up and nodded at Jake. "Morning. Sleep, okay? Better than I have in months," Jake said honestly. "Thank you again for," Roy waved him off. "Coffee's fresh. Help yourself." Jake poured a cup and sat at the same chair he'd used the night before. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was warm and real. Roy put a plate in front of him, pancakes, bacon, and scrambled eggs. More food than Jake usually saw in 3 days. "This is too much," Jake said. "I can't keep taking from you like this." Roy sat down with his own plate and took a sip of coffee. "You ever work on a ranch before?" The question caught Jake off guard. "No, sir, I worked in an office before everything went wrong." "Figures, city hands are soft." Roy cut into his pancakes. "Got work needs doing around here. Fences that need fixing, horses that need feeding, barn that needs cleaning. You willing to work for your keep?" Jake felt something lift in his chest. Work meant purpose. Work meant he wouldn't just be taking charity. "Yes, sir, I'll work hard, I promise. We'll see." Roy's tone wasn't mean, just practical. "Finish eating, then I'll show you around." After breakfast, Roy led Jake outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, nothing like the smoggy cities Jake had been sleeping in for weeks. The ranch wasn't huge, but it was well kept. There was a barn painted red with white trim, several fenced pastures, and outbuildings that looked sturdy and functional. "Got 12 horses?" Roy said, walking toward the barn. "Mostly retired rodeo stock now. They earned their keep, so now I earn theirs." Inside the barn, Jake could hear horses moving around in their stalls, the soft sounds of animals who knew their routine. Roy showed him where the feed was kept, how much each horse got, and which ones had special needs. "This old girl here," Roy said, stopping in front of a stall containing a gray mare with kind eyes. "This is Dusty. She was a barrel racer back in the day. Won me more prize money than any other horse I ever rode. Now she's got arthritis, so she gets special medicine with her feed." Jake watched Roy's face as he talked about the horse. There was real affection there, the kind of love that comes from years of partnership and trust. Roy reached out and scratched Dusty behind the ears, and she nickered softly in response. "You afraid of horses?" Roy asked. "I don't know. Never been around them much." Roy opened the stall door and led Dusty out into the barn aisle. She was bigger than Jake had expected, but she moved slowly and seemed gentle. "Hold out your hand flat like this. Let her smell you." Jake did as he was told. Dusty's nose was soft and warm as she sniffed his palm. Then she nudged his hand with her muzzle, like she was saying hello. "She likes you," Roy said. "Animals can tell things about people. They don't lie or pretend. If they trust you, it means something." For the next few hours, Roy showed Jake the basics of ranch work. How to fill water troughs, how to muck out stalls, how to check fence posts for damage. The work was physical and simple, but Jake found himself enjoying it. There was something satisfying about doing tasks with his hands, seeing immediate results from his effort. By lunchtime, Jake was exhausted, but in a good way. His muscles ached, but it was the kind of ache that comes from useful work, not from sleeping on concrete. Roy made sandwiches, and they ate them sitting on the porch, looking out over the desert. "You did good this morning," Roy said. "Better than I expected for someone who's never done ranch work." Jake felt a small glow of pride. It had been a long time since anyone had complimented his work. "Thank you. It feels good to be useful again." Roy was quiet for a while, chewing his sandwich and watching the horses in the distance. Finally, he spoke. "Mind if I ask what happened? How you ended up where you were yesterday?" Jake's stomach tightened. He'd known this question would come eventually, but he still wasn't ready for it. "It's a long story. Got time?" Jake stared out at the desert, trying to figure out where to start. "I had a job in the city. Good job, actually. I was an accountant for a big company. Had an apartment, a car, thought I had my life figured out." Roy didn't say anything, just waited for Jake to continue. "Then my dad got sick. Cancer. I started missing work to take care of him, help my mom. Company wasn't understanding about it. They said I could take unpaid leave, but we needed the money for his medical bills." Jake's voice got quieter. "He died anyway. 6 months of fighting, and he died anyway. Sorry to hear that. After the funeral, I couldn't get it together. Couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything right. Started drinking to numb it all. Lost my job, then my apartment, then my car. My mom blamed me for not being there enough when Dad was sick, so she stopped talking to me too." Jake had never told anyone the whole story before. It felt strange to say it all out loud, like he was talking about someone else's life. "Been on the road for about 2 months now. Thought maybe if I could get to California, start fresh somewhere new, things would get better. But the car broke down and I ran out of money and ... He shrugged. "You know the rest?" Roy finished his sandwich and leaned back in his chair. "Grief's a funny thing. Hits everyone different. Some people get angry, some people get sad, some people just get lost." "Sounds like you got lost." "Yeah, I guess I did." "Good thing about being lost," Roy said, "is that it means you can be found." Again, that afternoon, Roy put Jake to work repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. It was simple work, digging new post holes, setting new posts, stretching wire. But Jake found himself focusing completely on the task, his mind finally quiet for the first time in months. As the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake looked back at what they'd accomplished. 50 feet of sturdy fence that would keep the horses safe and secure. It wasn't much, but it was something solid, something that would last. "Not bad for a city boy," Roy said, examining their work. "We'll make a ranch hand out of you yet." Walking back to the house, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, like he belonged somewhere, even if it was just for now. 3 weeks had passed since Jake first knocked on Roy's door, and the routine of ranch life was starting to feel natural. Wake up at sunrise, feed the horses, fix whatever needed fixing, eat lunch on the porch, work until sunset. Simple, honest work that left him tired in a good way, instead of the bone-deep exhaustion that came from having nowhere to go and nothing to do. Jake had put on some weight, and his hands were getting calloused from handling tools and rope. Roy had given him some old work clothes that fit better than his torn jeans and dirty shirt. In the bathroom mirror, Jake was starting to recognize himself again. Still thin, still rough around the edges, but no longer looking like a man who had given up completely. But with the return of physical strength came something Jake wasn't prepared for. His emotions were coming back too. For months, he'd been so focused on basic survival that he'd pushed everything else down deep. Now that he wasn't worried about where his next meal would come from or where he'd sleep, all the feelings he'd been avoiding were starting to surface. It started with dreams. Every night, Jake would see his father's face in the hospital bed, pale and thin from the chemotherapy. He'd wake up with his heart racing, remembering conversations they'd never finished and things he'd never said. During the day he could keep busy with ranch work, but at night there was nowhere to hide. Roy noticed, of course. Roy noticed everything, though he rarely commented directly. He'd just appear with an extra cup of coffee when Jake was having a particularly rough morning, or find an especially demanding task to keep Jake's hands and mind occupied when the sadness seemed too heavy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jake finally broke. He'd been thinking about his dad all day, remembering how they used to watch baseball games together when Jake was a kid. His father had been a patient man, always willing to explain the rules and statistics, never getting annoyed when Jake asked the same questions over and over. "I failed him," Jake said suddenly, the words coming out before he could stop them. Roy looked over from his rocking chair but didn't say anything. "My dad, I failed him when he needed me most." Jake's voice was thick with emotion. He was dying, and I was more worried about my job than spending time with him. And then when he was gone, I couldn't handle it. I fell apart completely. "Tell me about him," Roy said quietly. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "He was a good man. Worked construction his whole life, never missed a day unless he was really sick. He built half the houses in our neighborhood with his own hands. Always said there was dignity in building things that would last longer than you would." The irony wasn't lost on Jake. Here he was, learning to build and fix things on Roy's ranch, finally understanding what his father had meant about finding purpose in honest work. "He wanted me to take over his construction business," Jake continued, "but I thought I was too smart for that. Went to college, got my accounting degree, got a fancy office job. Dad was proud of me, but I think he was a little hurt too. I thought his work wasn't good enough for me." Roy rocked slowly in his chair. "You think he would have wanted you to sacrifice your career to take care of him?" "I don't know, maybe, but I didn't even try. The company said I could take unpaid leave, and I said no because we needed the money for his medical bills. But really I was scared. Scared of watching him get sicker, scared of dealing with all the emotions. So I kept going to work and told myself I was being responsible. And after he died?" Jake was quiet for a long time. "After he died, I realized I'd wasted the last few months I could have had with him. And the guilt just ate me alive. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. Started drinking to numb the pain, but that just made everything worse." The admission hung in the air between them. Jake had never said it out loud before, that he'd become dependent on alcohol to get through each day. Saying it to Roy felt like confessing to a priest. Company gave me a second chance, then a third chance, but I kept messing up. Missing deadlines, making mistakes, showing up late or not at all. Finally, they had no choice but to let me go. Jake laughed bitterly. Funny thing is, by then I was almost relieved. I hated that job anyway, even before Dad got sick. I just didn't know what else to do with my life. Roy was quiet for a few minutes, just rocking and watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, he spoke. I lost my wife about 15 years ago." This was the first time Roy had mentioned having a wife. Jake looked over at him, surprised. "Cancer, like your dad. She fought it for 2 years, and I was right there with her through every treatment, every hospital stay, every sleepless night." Roy's voice was steady, but Jake could hear the pain underneath. "Thought I was doing everything right, being the perfect husband, never leaving her side." "That sounds like you were a good husband," Roy shook his head. "Was so focused on taking care of her that I forgot to take care of myself. And I was so scared of losing her that I never talked to her about what was really happening. We spent 2 years pretending everything was going to be fine, never saying the things we needed to say." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of things?" "How scared we both were. How much we loved each other. What she wanted me to do with my life after she was gone." Roy's voice got quieter. "She died without us ever having those conversations. And I spent the next 5 years drinking myself to death because I felt like I'd failed her." The similarity to Jake's story was striking. "What changed?" "Hit rock bottom just like you did. Lost this ranch, lost my savings, lost everything except the clothes on my back. Ended up sleeping under bridges in Phoenix, begging for change outside liquor stores. Roy's voice was matter of fact, but Jake could imagine the pain behind those words. One day, an old cowboy I'd known from the rodeo. Circuit found me passed out in an alley. He was running a halfway house for a Dick's, and he told me the same thing I'm telling you now. What's that? Grief isn't a punishment for loving someone. It's the price we pay for having something worth losing. And drinking yourself to death doesn't honor the person you lost. It just creates more loss. Jake felt tears running down his face. How did you get through it? Same way you're getting through it now, one day at a time. Stayed sober, worked hard, rebuilt my life piece by piece. Took me 3 years to save enough money to buy this place back from the bank. But the work gave me purpose, and purpose gave me hope. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars started to appear in the desert sky. Jake felt something loosening. In his chest, like a knot that had been tied too tight for too long, was finally starting to come undone. My mom blames me, Jake said eventually. She thinks if I'd quit my job to take care of Dad, maybe things would have been different. Maybe he would have lived longer. Mothers grieve different than sons do, Roy said. She's looking for someone to blame because the alternative is accepting that sometimes bad things just happen to good people. That's harder than being angry. I tried calling her a few times before I ended up on the street. She wouldn't talk to me. Saw it, I'd already caused enough pain. Roy was quiet for a moment. People say things when they're hurting that they don't always mean. Doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. I don't think she ever forgive me. Maybe not. But that doesn't mean you can't forgive yourself. Jake looked over at Roy in the darkness. How do you forgive yourself for failing someone you love? By learning to be the person they would have wanted you to be. By not wasting the life they would have wanted you to live. Roy stood up and stretched. Your dad sounds like he was a man who believed in building things that last. Maybe it's time you started building something that would make him proud. As they headed inside for the night, Jake felt something shift inside him. The pain was still there, it probably always would be, but it felt different now. Like a weight dragging him down and more like a responsibility to carry forward. He thought about his father's hands, strong and scarred from years of honest work, and looked down at his own hands, finally starting to show the signs of useful labor. Maybe Roy was right. Maybe it was time to start building something that would last. The conversation on the porch that night changed something between Jake and Roy. It was like a wall had come down, and now they could really start the work of rebuilding Jake's life. But Roy's approach wasn't what Jake expected. There were no lectures, no self-help books, no grand speeches about turning his life around. Instead, Roy started teaching him things small, practical things that seemed simple but were actually laying the foundation for something bigger. It started the next morning at breakfast. Roy put a notebook and pen next to Jake's plate along with his coffee and eggs. What's this for? Jake asked. You're going to start keeping track of things, Roy said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Write down what you did yesterday, what you plan to do today, how much money you earned. But I don't have any money to track. Roy pulled out his wallet and counted out $40. You do now. That's what you earned this week helping around the ranch. Going rate for ranch work around here. Jake stared at the money like it was a foreign object. I can't take this. You're already giving me food and a place to sleep. Work deserves pay. That's how the world works. Roy pushed the money across the table. You earned it, you keep it. But you write down every penny you spend, every penny you save. And every week, we'll talk about your money and make a plan for the next week. Jake picked up the pen with shaking hands. It had been months since he'd had any money that was truly his, earned through his own effort. The $40 wasn't much, but it felt like a fortune. What should I buy? He asked. That's up to you. But I'd suggest starting with things you need, not things you want. Jake thought about it as he wrote in the notebook. He needed clothes. That fit better. He needed his own toiletries instead of using Roy's. He needed to start building a life that was his own, even if it was a small one. After breakfast, Roy announced they were going to town. Cedar Ridge's main street was quiet. On a Wednesday morning, but the few businesses that were open seemed to know Roy well. At the general store, the owner greeted him by name and asked about his horses. At the barber shop, the barber waved from the window. "You know everyone here," Jake observed as they walked down the sidewalk. "Small town. Been here 15 years? Now, ever since I got sober and bought the ranch back. People remember when you make an effort to be part of the community." Their first stop was a thrift store run by the local church. Jake had never shopped at a thrift store before in his old life. He'd bought everything new from department stores. But Roy showed him how to look for quality clothes that just needed a good washing. Jake found 2 pairs of jeans that fit, 3 work shirts, and a warm jacket for $22. "This is all good stuff," Jake said, amazed at what his money could buy. People donate things they barely wore. You just have to know what to look for. Roy examined a shirt Jake was considering. "This one's got good stitching. It'll last." At the pharmacy, Jake bought his own shampoo, soap, and toothbrush. Small things, but they felt huge. These were his things, bought with his own money, and nobody could take them away from him. The last stop was the most important one, though Jake didn't realize it at first. Roy led him to a small office building on a side street with a sign that read, "Cedar Ridge Community Center. What are we doing here?" Jake asked. "There's someone I want you to meet." Inside, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes greeted Roy with a hug. "Roy, good to see you. How are the horses?" "Doing well, thanks." "Beth, I'd like you to meet Jake. He's been helping me out on the ranch." Beth shook Jake's hand warmly. "Nice to meet you, Jake. Any friend of Roy's is a friend of mine." Roy explained that Beth ran support groups for people dealing with addiction and grief. Thought maybe Jake would like to know about the meetings. Jake felt his stomach tighten. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "That's okay," Beth said gently. "The meetings are here every Tuesday and Thursday evening at 7. If you ever want to come, just show up. No pressure, no commitment. Just people who understand what you're going through." On the drive back to the ranch, Jake was quiet. The idea of sitting in a room full of strangers and talking about his problems made him nervous. But Roy didn't push it, which somehow made Jake more curious about it. That afternoon, Roy taught Jake something new, how to balance a checkbook. Even though Jake had been an accountant, he'd let his own finances become a mess before he lost everything. Roy showed him how to track every dollar coming in and going out, how to plan for expenses, how to set aside money for savings. "But I only made $40 this week," Jake protested. "There's nothing left to save after buying the clothes and stuff." "There's always something left to save, even if it's just $1. Roy showed him in the notebook. "Save $1 this week, $2 next week. It adds up faster than you think." Jake wrote savings $1 in the notebook. It felt silly, saving such a small amount, but Roy was right. It was something. Over the next few days, Roy continued the lessons. He taught Jake how to cook simple, healthy meals instead of relying on fast food or junk, how to maintain his clothes so they'd last longer, how to fix small things around the house instead of throwing them away, how to plan his days so he'd have time for work, rest, and taking care of himself. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Jake asked one evening as they worked on repairing a gate latch. "Because nobody taught you before, and you're going to need these skills when you're ready to be on your own again." The words hit Jake harder than he expected. "You want me to leave?" Roy looked up from the latch he was adjusting. "Want's got nothing to do with it. You can stay here as long as you need to. But part of getting better is knowing you could leave if you wanted to. Right now, you're dependent on me for everything. That's not healthy for either of us." Jake felt a flash of panic, "But I'm not ready. I don't have enough money saved. I don't have a car. I don't have anywhere to go. That's why we're building these skills now. So when you are ready, you'll have what you need." That night, Jake lay in bed thinking about what Roy had said. The old Jake would have been offended, would have felt rejected and abandoned. But this Jake could see the wisdom in it. Roy wasn't trying to get rid of him. He was trying to give him the tools to rebuild his life from the ground up. The next week, Jake earned $50 instead of $40. Roy had given him more responsibilities around the ranch, and he'd worked extra hours repairing storm damage to the barn. When he wrote the amount in his notebook, he felt a small surge of pride. Progress. He also started keeping track of other things in the notebook. How he felt each day, what he was grateful for. Goals for the following week. At first it felt awkward, like homework he didn't want to do, but gradually it became a habit. And the habit gave structure to his days. Thursday evening, Jake surprised himself by asking Roy about the support group meeting. "Still want to check it out?" Roy asked. "I think so. Maybe. I don't know what I'd say to those people." "You don't have to say anything. Just listen the first time. See if it feels right." That evening, Jake walked into the Cedar Ridge Community Center meeting room feeling like his skin was on fire with nervousness. There were about 12 people sitting in a circle of folding chairs, men and women of different ages, but they all had something in Jake's eyes that he recognized. They looked like people who had been broken and were trying to put themselves back together. Beth welcomed him warmly and introduced him to the group. "This is Jake. He's new to our community." A man named Tom, who looked like he'd been a construction worker before whatever brought him here, nodded at Jake. "Welcome. We've all been where you are." Jake just listened that first night. He heard stories that sounded familiar, people who'd lost jobs, relationships, homes, people who'd made mistakes and were trying to make amends, people who were learning to forgive themselves and build new lives. When the meeting ended, Jake felt lighter somehow. Not fixed, not healed, but less alone. On the drive home, Roy asked how it went. "It was good," Jake said, surprising himself. With the honesty, hard, but good. "I think I'll go back next week." Roy just nodded, like he'd known Jake would say that all along. That night, Jake wrote in his notebook, "Day 35 on the ranch, earned $50 this week. Saved $3, went to my first support group meeting. Still scared about the future, but feeling stronger. Dad would be proud of the work I'm doing with my hands." It was the first time he'd written about his father without crying. 3 months had passed since Jake first stumbled onto Roy's porch, and the change was remarkable. Not just in how he looked, though his face had filled out and his eyes were clear now, but in how he carried himself. There was purpose in his step when he walked to the barn each morning, and his hands moved with confidence as he worked. The notebook Roy had given him was almost full now. Pages of daily entries tracking his progress, his earnings, his goals. Jake had saved $147, which felt like a small fortune to someone who'd been living on the street just a few months ago. More importantly, he'd learned to see each dollar as a building block toward independence. The support group meetings had become a regular part of his week. Tuesday and Thursday evenings at 7, Jake would drive Roy's old pickup truck into town and sit in that circle of folding chairs with people who understood his struggle. He'd started sharing his own story now, hesitantly at first, but with growing confidence as he realized no one was judging him. It was at one of these meetings that Jake heard about a job opening. Tom, the former construction worker who'd welcomed Jake on his first night, mentioned that his current employer was looking for help. "It's just part-time," Tom said after the meeting ended. "Auto repair shop needs someone to do basic maintenance, organize parts, that kind of thing. Owner's a good guy, understands about second chances." Jake felt his heart start racing. A real job with real pay in the real world. "Do you think he'd consider me? I don't have much experience with cars." "Experience can be learned. Character can't." Tom pulled a business card from his wallet. "Tell him I sent you." "But Jake, you need to be honest about your situation. Don't try to hide anything or make excuses. Just tell the truth." That night, Jake barely slept. He kept rehearsing what he'd say, how he'd explain the gap in his work history, how he'd convince someone to take a chance on him. By morning, his stomach was twisted in knots. Roy found him at the kitchen table at 5 a.m., staring at the business card and nursing his third cup of coffee. "You're going to wear a hole in that card if you keep staring at it," Roy said, pouring his own coffee. "What if he says no? What if I mess up the interview? What if I'm not ready for this?" Roy sat down across from him. "What if you are ready? What if he says yes? What if this is exactly what you need right now?" Jake looked up at him. How do you know when you're ready? You don't. You just take the next step and trust that you've done the work to prepare for it. Later that morning, Jake stood outside Martinez Auto Repair, wearing his best thrift store clothes and trying to calm his nerves. The shop was busy, cars parked everywhere, the sound of air tools and music coming from inside. Through the open bay doors, he could see mechanics working under the hoods of various vehicles. A man in his 50s with grease-stained coveralls approached him. "You Jake? Tom said you might be stopping by." "Yes, sir. I'm here about the job." "Carlos." Martinez had kind eyes and a firm handshake. He led Jake to a small office cluttered with invoices and car parts catalogs. "Tom tells me you're getting back on your feet. Want to tell me about that?" Jake had practiced this moment, but sitting across from a potential employer, all his rehearsed words disappeared. Instead, he just told the truth. About losing his father, losing his job, ending up on the street. About Roy taking him in, about the support group, about learning to rebuild his life one day at a time. Carlos listened without interrupting. When Jake finished, there was a long moment of silence. "I appreciate your honesty," Carlos said finally. "Not many people would be that upfront about their struggles," shows character. "Tom said you understand about second chances." Carlos smiled. "I've been in recovery for 8 years myself. Lost everything to gambling addiction before I got help. Community gave me a chance when I was ready to change, and now I try to do the same for others." He stood up. "Let me show you around the shop." For the next hour, Carlos explained the work. It wasn't complicated: organizing inventory, cleaning parts, basic maintenance like oil changes and tire rotations. The pay was $12 an hour for 20 hours a week. Not much, but it was honest work with room to learn and grow. "When can you start?" Carlos asked. Jake felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "You mean I got the job? Tom vouched for you, and I trust his judgment. Plus, I can see you're serious about changing your life. That's the most important qualification as far as I'm concerned." Walking back to Roy's truck, Jake felt like he was floating. He had a job. A real job with real pay and real responsibilities. He couldn't wait to tell Roy, but Roy's reaction surprised him. Instead of celebrating, Roy just nodded and said, "Good, now the real work begins." "What do you mean?" "Having a job is easy compared to keeping a job. That's where most people mess up when they're trying to get their lives back together." Over the next few days, Roy helped Jake prepare for success at his new job. They practiced getting up early and being ready to work. They planned out his schedule so he could balance the shop job with his responsibilities on the ranch. They talked about workplace relationships, how to take criticism, how to ask for help when he needed it. "Remember," Roy said, "your past doesn't define you, but it's part of your story. Don't hide from it, but don't let it become an excuse either." Jake's first day at Martinez Auto Repair was nerve-wracking, but Carlos was patient and encouraging. He started Jake off with simple tasks: sorting bolts, organizing tool drawers, sweeping the shop floor. Nothing glamorous, but Jake attacked each job with the same intensity he'd learned to bring to ranch work. The other mechanics were friendly but cautious. Jake understood. They were probably wondering about the new guy, where he'd come from, whether he could be trusted. He decided to let his work speak for itself. By the end of his first week, Jake had earned $240. Combined with what Roy paid him for ranch work, it was more money than he'd seen in months. But more than the money, he felt the satisfaction of being useful, of contributing something valuable to the world. One evening at the support group, Jake shared his good news. The circle of faces around him lit up with genuine happiness and encouragement. These people understood. What a huge step this was, how much courage it took to put himself back out in the world. "I'm proud of you," said an older woman named Helen who'd been coming to the meetings for years. "But remember, success isn't just about getting the job. It's about showing up every day, even when you don't feel like it." Her words proved prophetic. 3 weeks into the job, Jake woke up feeling terrible. Not sick, exactly, but overwhelmed. The weight of responsibility, the pressure of proving himself, the fear of messing up, it all crashed down on him at once. His old instincts told him to hide, to make excuses, to run away before he could fail. Instead, he forced himself to get dressed and go to work. The day was hard, everything felt like too much effort, and he made more mistakes than usual. But he stayed, he did his job. He didn't quit. At the end of the day, Carlos pulled him aside. Rough day? Jake nodded, expecting to be fired. Good job pushing through it. That's the difference between someone who's serious about recovery and someone who's just going through the motions. That night, Jake called his sister for the first time in over a year. His hands were shaking as he dialed the number he still knew by heart. Hello? Her voice was cautious, like she was expecting bad news. Lisa, it's me. It's Jake. There was a long pause. Jake? Oh my God, where are you? Are you okay? The conversation was awkward and emotional. Lisa had been angry and worried and hurt. She'd assumed the worst when he disappeared. But she listened as Jake told her about Roy, about the ranch, about his job and the support group. She didn't forgive him right away. That would take time. But she agreed to stay in touch. I'm proud of you for getting help, she said before hanging up. Dad would be proud too. That night, Jake sat on Roy's porch and looked up at the stars. 3 months ago, he'd been a broken man with no hope and no future. Now he had a job, some money in the bank, people who cared about him, and contact with his family again. It wasn't everything. He still had a long way to go, but it was something. It was a beginning. In his notebook that night he wrote, Day 95. Earned $240 this week. Total savings, $287. Called Lisa. She didn't hang up on me. Small victories are still victories. 6 months had passed since Jake's first night at Roy's ranch, and life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Jake was working full-time at the auto shop now. Carlos had been so impressed with his work ethic and reliability that he'd offered him more hours. The money was steady, and Jake had managed to save over $800. For the first time in years, he was thinking about the future instead of just surviving day to day. He'd also become a regular at the support group meetings, no longer just listening but actively helping newer members navigate their own recovery journeys. There was something powerful about being able to share his experience, to offer hope to people who were where he'd been just months ago. It was on a Tuesday evening in late October when everything changed. Jake was driving back from his support group meeting, taking the familiar route through town toward Roy's ranch. The desert air was crisp, and the stars were just starting to appear in the darkening sky as he turned onto the dirt road leading to Roy's property. His headlights caught something that made his heart skip a beat. A figure was walking along the side of the road, stumbling slightly. Even from a distance, Jake could tell the person was in trouble. The walk was unsteady, desperate, the same way Jake had walked 6 months ago. When he was barely holding himself together, Jake slowed the truck and pulled alongside the figure. It was a young woman, maybe early 20s, with dark hair tangled around her face. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and she had a backpack slung over one shoulder that looked like it contained everything she owned. When his headlights hit her, she threw up a hand to shield her eyes and backed away from the truck. Hey, it's okay, Jake called through the open window. I'm not going to hurt you. You look like you could use some help. The woman stopped but didn't come any closer. In the truck's headlights, Jake could see her face was bruised, and there was fear in her eyes that went deeper than just being startled by a stranger. I'm fine, she said, but her voice was shaky. Just walking. Jake recognized that tone. It was the same mix of pride and desperation he'd heard in his own voice 6 months ago. He pulled the truck over and got out slowly, keeping his hands visible, and his movements calm. Walking where? It's 20 miles to the next town, and there's nothing but desert between here and there. The woman clutched her backpack tighter. I said, I'm fine. I believe you, Jake said gently. But fine doesn't mean you don't need help. My name's Jake. I live just up the road with a friend of mine. We've got food, clean water, a safe place to rest if you need it. She studied his face in the truck's headlights, trying to decide if she could trust him. Jake remembered making the same calculation 6 months ago when Roy had offered him help. Why would you help a stranger? She asked. Because someone helped me when I needed it most. And because you look like I felt not too long ago. Something in his voice must have convinced her because she took a tentative step closer. I don't have any money to pay you back. Nobody's asking for money. Jake could see her weighing her options. The desert at night was dangerous, cold, full of wildlife, easy to get lost in. And she was clearly running from something, given the bruises and the scared look in her eyes. What's your name? Jake asked. Lucy, she said quietly. Nice to meet you, Lucy. How about we start with just getting you something to eat and drink? No strings attached? If you want to leave after that, I'll drive you wherever you want to go. Lucy looked down the dark road ahead, then back at Jake. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but just for a little while. The drive to Roy's ranch was quiet. Lucy sat pressed against the passenger door, ready to run if she needed to. Jake didn't try to make conversation, just drove carefully and let her process what was happening. When they pulled up to Roy's house, the porch light was on and Roy was sitting in his usual spot as if he'd been expecting them. He stood up as Jake and Lucy got out of the truck, and Jake saw Roy take in Lucy's appearance, the bruises, the fear, the desperate way she held onto her backpack. Roy, Jake said, this is Lucy. She needs some help. Roy studied Lucy for a moment, the same way he'd studied Jake 6 months ago. Then he nodded toward the house. Well, come on in then. Made too much dinner anyway. Lucy looked between Jake and Roy, confusion clear on her face. You don't even know me. Why are you helping me? Roy's answer was simple. Because we've been where you are. Inside the warm kitchen, Lucy slowly began to relax. Roy moved around the space with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown when Jake first arrived. Heating up leftover stew and making coffee, Jake watched him work and realized he was seeing himself in Roy's position for the first time. You don't have to tell us anything you don't want to, Jake said as Lucy ate. But if you wanted to, we're good listeners. Lucy ate 3 bowls of stew before she spoke. I was living with my boyfriend in Phoenix. Thought I loved him, thought he loved me, but he started drinking more, getting angry more. Last week he ... She touched the bruise on her cheek. I knew I had to leave, but I didn't have anywhere to go. No family, no friends with room for me. Jake felt his chest tighten. He'd heard similar stories at the support group meetings, but this felt different, more personal. This was happening right in front of him, and he had the power to help. So you just started walking? Roy asked. Took a bus as far as I could afford, then started walking. Figured I'd get to Los Angeles eventually, find work, start over. She laughed bitterly. Stupid plan, I guess. Not stupid, Jake said. Takes courage to leave a bad situation, even when you don't know what comes next. Lucy looked at him with surprise. You sound like you know about that. Jake found himself telling his story, the short version but honest. About losing everything, ending up on the street, finding Roy's ranch. About learning to rebuild his life one day at a time. Lucy listened with growing amazement. You really were homeless? But you seem so ... normal now. Normal's relative, Jake said with a smile. 6 months ago, I was grimy, needy, and barely alive. Roy gave me a chance to change that. Roy had been listening quietly through all of this. Now he spoke up. Lucy, you're welcome to stay here tonight. Clean bed, safe place to sleep. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next. I can't pay you anything, Lucy said again. Good thing we're not asking for payment, Roy replied that night. As Roy showed Lucy to the spare room that used to be Jake's, Jake felt something he'd never experienced before. He was on the other side of the help equation now. Instead of being the one who needed rescuing, he was part of the rescuing. It felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. After Lucy had gone to bed, Jake and Roy sat on the porch like they had so many nights before. Feels different, doesn't it? Roy said, being the one offering help instead of needing it. Yeah, scary. What if we can't help her? What if she doesn't want to be helped? Then we'll have given her a safe place to rest and some good meals. Sometimes that's enough. Roy rocked slowly in his chair. But I think she wants help. She just doesn't know how to accept it yet. How do you know? Same way I knew with you. She's here, isn't she? Could have kept walking, could have said no to getting in the truck, but she's here. Jake thought about that as he looked out over the desert. 6 months ago, He'd been the broken person stumbling down a dark road. Tonight, he'd been the one with the truck and the offer of help. The circle was completing itself in a way he'd never expected. "Roy," Jake said, "I think I'm ready to start looking for my own place." Roy didn't seem surprised. "Been wondering when you'd say that. You've got enough saved up for a deposit and first month's rent. Got steady work, reliable transportation? What's holding you back? Fear, I guess? Fear of messing up, of not being able to handle it on my own. Fear's natural. But you're not the same person who showed up here 6 months ago. You've done the work, built the skills, earned your independence." Jake nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and terror. "But I want to stay involved here. With Lucy, with other people who might need help?" Roy smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. This ranch has always been too big for one person anyway." As they headed inside for the night, Jake realized that tomorrow would be the beginning of a new chapter. Not just for Lucy, but for all of them. He was ready to take the next step in his own journey while helping someone else take their first steps. The cycle of healing and helping was continuing, and Jake was proud to be part of it. 1 year, that's how long it had been since Jake first stumbled onto Roy's porch, desperate and broken. Now, as he stood in the doorway of his own small apartment above the auto shop, Jake could barely believe how much his life had changed. The apartment wasn't fancy, just a bedroom, kitchen, and living room with secondhand furniture, but it was his. Every piece paid for with money he'd earned, every bill paid on time, every decision his own to make. The transition to living on his own had been harder than he'd expected. After months of Roy's steady presence and structured routine, the quiet of his own space felt overwhelming at first. There were nights when he'd lie awake wondering if he was really ready for independence, if he'd made a mistake leaving the safety of the ranch. But those doubts came less often now, replaced by a growing confidence in his ability to handle whatever life threw at him. Jake's notebook from those early days sat on his kitchen table, filled with the daily entries that had helped him track his progress. Now he kept a new notebook, still writing every day, but the entries were different. Instead of just recording his survival, he was planning his future. He'd enrolled in community college classes to study automotive technology, dreaming of maybe running his own shop someday. Carlos had been encouraging, even offering to help with tuition if Jake kept working hard. The support group meetings remained a constant in his life. Jake had become one of the senior members now, the guy newer people looked to for guidance and hope. He'd sponsored 3 people through their early recovery, including a man named Pete who reminded Jake of himself, proud, stubborn, convinced. He could handle everything alone until he finally admitted he needed help, but it was Lucy who had taught Jake the most about what it really meant to pay forward the kindness he'd received. She'd stayed at Roy's ranch for 2 months, slowly learning to trust again after the trauma she'd experienced. Unlike Jake, whose problems had been mostly self-inflicted, Lucy was dealing with the aftermath of someone else's violence. It required a different kind of healing, one that involved police reports, restraining orders, and therapy sessions in addition to the practical work of rebuilding a life. Jake had driven her to court dates and counseling appointments, the same way Roy had driven him to his first support group meetings. He'd helped her find a job at a local diner, vouching for her character the way Tom had vouched for him at the auto shop. He'd watched her save her first $100, and seen the same pride in her eyes that he'd felt when he'd reached that milestone. Now, Lucy had her own small place in town and was taking night classes to become a nurse. She'd found her strength. Not in spite of what she'd been through, but because of it. She wanted to help other women who'd faced domestic violence, to be the person she'd needed when she was walking down that dark desert road. The 3 of them, Jake, Roy, and Lucy, had formed an unlikely family of sorts. They met for dinner every Sunday at Roy's ranch, sharing updates on their lives and planning how to help the next person who might need it. Because there always was a next person. In the past year, they'd helped a veteran named Charlie who'd been living in his car after losing his disability benefits to bureaucratic red tape. They'd taken in a teenager named Alex whose parents had kicked him out for being gay, helping him finish high school and find acceptance in a world that hadn't always been kind to him. Each person brought their own story, their own challenges, their own strengths. The ranch had become an unofficial halfway house, though they never called it that. Roy had renovated the old bunkhouse to provide more space, and Jake had helped with the construction work. They didn't advertise their services or seek out people to help. Word just spread quietly through the community. If you needed a hand up instead of a handout, if you were serious about changing your life, Roy's ranch was a place where that was possible. Jake's phone rang as he was getting ready for work one Tuesday morning. It was his sister Lisa calling for their weekly check-in. The conversations had gotten easier over the months, the anger and hurt gradually replaced by genuine care and slowly rebuilding trust. "How's the apartment?" she asked. "Good, quiet, but good. I'm thinking about getting a dog," Lisa laughed. "Eh? Dog? That's a big step." "Yeah, well, Roy's been saying I need something to take care of, says it's good for the soul." Roy's a smart man. "When am I going to meet this guy who saved my little brother?" Jake smiled. Lisa had been talking about visiting for months, but something always came up. "Whenever you're ready, he'd like to meet you too." After work that day, Jake drove out to the ranch as he did most evenings. He found Roy in the barn, showing a new arrival how to properly groom one of the horses. The new guy was probably 40, with the soft hands and pale skin of someone who'd spent his life working in offices. His name was David, and he'd lost everything in a stock market crash. Not just his money, but his marriage, his house, his sense of identity. "Jake," Roy called out, "come show David how to pick out Dusty's hooves." "You remember your first time doing this?" Jake remembered. He'd been terrified of the horse, convinced he'd get kicked or bitten. Now he moved around Dusty with easy confidence, showing David how to lift her foot and clean out the packed dirt and small stones. "The key is staying calm," Jake explained. "Horses can sense fear, so if you're nervous, they get nervous too." David nodded, concentrating hard as he attempted to copy Jake's movements. "How long did it take you to feel comfortable doing this?" "Couple weeks, maybe." "But I'd never been around horses before." "You'll pick it up faster if you don't overthink it." Later, as they sat on the porch with their evening coffee, Roy brought up something that had been on Jake's mind too. "Been thinking about making this official," Roy said. "Making what official?" "This." Roy gestured toward the house, the barn, the peaceful evening scene. "What we've been doing here. There are legal ways to set up non-profit organizations, get funding, help more people properly." Jake had been thinking the same thing. "You mean like a real recovery center?" "Something like that. Keep it small, keep it personal, but do it right. Maybe partner with the county, work with the courts to give people alternatives to jail time for nonviolent offenses." The idea was exciting and terrifying at the same time. It would mean taking their informal operation and turning it into something bigger, with real responsibility and accountability. "What would that mean for you?" Jake asked. "Would you still live here?" "This is my home. Always will be. But it could be home to a lot more people who need it." They talked late into the night about the possibilities. How they could structure it, who they'd need to talk to, what kind of funding might be available. Jake found himself thinking about his father, about the pride his dad had taken in building things that would last longer than he would. 2 weeks later, Jake got a phone call that changed everything. It was his mother. "Jake?" Her voice was hesitant, unsure. "Mom." Jake's heart started racing. They hadn't spoken since before his father's funeral over 2 years ago. "Lisa gave me your number. She said you're doing well." "I am. Doing okay." There was a long pause. "I owe you an apology." "Several apologies, actually." Jake sat down hard in his kitchen chair. He dreamed of this conversation for months, but he'd also feared it. "You don't owe me anything, Mom." "Yes, I do. I blamed you for things that weren't your fault. I was angry and grief, and I took it out on you when you were struggling too." Her voice broke. "I'm sorry, son. I'm so sorry." They talked for an hour. She told him about the grief counseling she'd finally started, about how she'd come to understand that pushing Jake away hadn't honored his father's memory, it had dishonored it. Jake told her about Roy, about the ranch, about the work he was doing to help other people find their way back to themselves. Your father would be so proud of you, she said before they hung up. Not just for getting your life back together, but for helping others do the same. That night, Jake sat in his apartment and looked out the window toward Roy's ranch. In the distance, he could see the lights of the house where David was probably settling in for his first full night, just like Jake had done a year ago. Tomorrow, Jake would drive out there and help with the morning chores. Maybe teach David something new about horses or fence repair or the simple satisfaction of honest work. But tonight, Jake opened his notebook and wrote, Day 365, full circle. Complete. Dad, I finally understand what you meant about building things that last. I'm not building houses, but I'm helping people rebuild their lives, and that's going to last forever. He closed the notebook and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to help, new opportunities to pay forward the grace he'd received. But tonight, for the first time in years, Jake felt complete. He'd found his way home, not to a place but to himself. And in finding himself, he'd learned how to help others find their way too. The cowboy who'd taken in a broken stranger had taught him the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to become who they were always meant to be.